you can sense that one of the things he wanted to do in these books is capture the consciousness of someone whose mind has gone as far into a mathematical reality as possible. Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I have a very special video because I was so moved and struck by and overcome by, possessed by, I don't know what you want to call it, enraptured by Cormac McCarthy's two latest novels, The Passenger and then Stella. This was absolutely the quintessential reading experience for me. These novels exemplify why I continue to read, why I continue to fight for time in my busy life to read, to seek out novels like this. With my whole Why Do We Read Fiction series, even though I'm not focusing on specific books when I consider Why Do We Read, these McCarthy novels are a perfect example of the type of fiction I'm talking about in the Why We Read Fiction series. I knew about halfway through reading The Passenger that I was not going to be able to do a typical, polished, professional, focused book review type of video where, it's really to the point and pulls out the major themes and some of my favorite passages. There's just no way I could limit talking about these books to a restrictive book review. So I decided pretty early on that what I would do is I would just take the two books and flip through it page by page or leaf by leaf and just tell you what I got out of reading these two books. In other words, I guess you could call this a running commentary, kind of like in movies when there's a special feature where the movie will play in real time, but then you'll hear the director or other people who were involved in making the film dubbed over top of it, just speaking about what's happening on the screen. Something like that. Another way you could look at it is I'm going to show you what it is about these novels that made me love them so much. Why is it that I got so much out of them and I'm compelled to reread them again and again? So sometimes along the way we'll linger for a very long time over different passages, or it might just be a quick little comment. I will say that if you haven't read the books yet, you probably don't want to watch this video. If you have read the books, then it's probably more fitting, more appropriate. I also want to point out that I chose not to read or look at anything about these novels before I had read them for myself. So I didn't even look at what the synopsis was, the blurbs, anything. I just knew, hey, Cormac McCarthy is coming out with two books that are related to one another with about a month in between the two publications. That was enough for me. So I went into it completely cold. And in fact, after the books came out late last year, there were several reviews that I set aside to read later. So one is James Wood reviewed these novels in the New Yorker, so I set that aside. Joy Williams reviewed it for Harper's, so I set that aside. And Michael Gora reviewed them for NYRB, and I set that aside. I also set aside the two relevant podcasts from the Reading McCarthy podcast. So this video right now, I still have only read the books for myself and I haven't heard what anybody else has to say about them. And so you're just getting it straight off the tap. And it'll also give, for those of you who are interested, it'll give you insight into the way my mind sort of works while I'm reading. After I'm done recording this, I'm going to take some time to read those reviews that I put on hold and listen to those podcasts, and then I'll come back and record my response to all of that and tag it onto this video. So I hope this is interesting. I hope it's fun. At the very least, if no one watches it, I'm going to have a blast just going back through these incredible novels. The Passenger, it opens up with 2 italicized sections. This is very familiar to McCarthy, to Faulkner, and usually when you see italics in McCarthy, you know that you're about to get some beautiful prose. Now, what's interesting, though, about these 2 little sections, the first one fits on a single page, and we're going to linger on that for a while. And then the second one is a much longer chapter. But I actually sat down and read these 2 italicized sections, and was so overwhelmed with all the directions that McCarthy immediately sent these books into that I reread it in that same sitting. And so it took me an hour to read 14 pages roughly. And then I was still so excited and gratefully overwhelmed that I read the 2 italicized sections again a third time before going on with the book. And part of this is just because I felt like the opening page was so deliberately crafted, so deliberately designed, that I wanted to linger over it and make sure that I stored up and put into the front of my memory everything that is going on here, because it felt like we were getting an overture to a Wagnerian opera. And then the first part of the first chapter, the italicized section with the kid, was something that seemed like it was straight out of Pynchon's mind. And so it was so heavily packed with allusion and play that I had to read it multiple times because I knew that I was missing things. So let's linger on this very first page of The Passenger. It fits on one page, just this one paragraph, and it reads, "It had snowed lightly in the night, and her frozen hair was gold and crystalline, and her eyes were frozen cold and hard as stones." And so you already get that classic incantatory, almost biblical prose style of McCarthy, which has been pointed out as being composed of parataxis. It's just constantly and. There's not a lot of subordinate clauses. There aren't really any subordinate clauses. It just keeps tacking on one clause after another. One of her yellow boots had fallen off and stood in the snow beneath her. The shape of her coat lay dusted in the snow where she'd dropped it, and she wore only a white dress, and she hung among the bare gray poles of the winter trees with her head bowed and her hands turned slightly outward, like those of certain ecumenical statues whose attitude asks that their history be considered. The first time I read that sentence with all of that incantatory prose leading up to it, that's one of those where you just stop reading and put your head back against the wall or against the back of your chair and close your eyes for a minute because it's so gorgeous. And I wrote here in the margin when I underlined that simile, like those of certain ecumenical statues whose attitude asks that their history be considered. And I put, "This is how I feel beholding these novels." I knew that I had something that was almost sacred, like an ecumenical statue. And I knew that I was going to be asked to consider history, big history, world history, American history, which is nothing new for McCarthy. But I also knew that there was going to be a history here. And this was before I realized that Stella Maris backs up about 8 years. But I also noticed that repetition of snow, and I put little ticks, little accent marks above each one. It had snowed lightly, and then stood in the snow beneath her, and then lay dusted in the snow. And, you know, for your average writer, you would be taught not to have so much redundancy and repetition, but to vary your language. And we'll see that snow will continue to come up. That the deep foundation of the world be considered. where it has its being in the sorrow of her creatures. The hunter knelt and stogged his rifle upright, and I just circled stogged because this is the perfect McCarthy verb. In the snow beside him, and took off his gloves and let them fall and folded his hands one upon the other. He thought that he should pray, but he'd no prayer for such a thing. He bowed his head. Tower of ivory, he said, house of gold. And we could see that Tower of Ivory and the House of Gold almost echoed in the figure of this young woman. We haven't been told yet, I don't think, that she is white, but we have been told that her frozen hair was gold and crystalline. Nonetheless, it could be the snow that's the Tower of Ivory. You just get this image and then a sort of mysticism in there in place of a prayer that this hunter doesn't have. Almost Tower of Ivory, House of Gold is almost something from a tarot deck or something like that. He knelt there for a long time. When he opened his eyes, he saw a small shape half buried in the snow. There's snow again. And he leaned and dusted away the snow and picked up a gold chain that held a steel key and a white gold ring. He slipped them into the pocket of his hunting coat. He'd heard the wind in the night, the wind's work, a trash can clattering over the bricks behind his house, the snow blowing out there in the forest in the dark. He looked up into those cold, enameled eyes, glinting blue in the weak winter light. She had tied her dress with a red sash so that she'd be found. Some bit of color in the scrupulous desolation. Beautiful sentence. On this Christmas day, this cold and barely spoken Christmas day. Now, I didn't realize this until a little bit later in the book, but the number 7 will come up so often that you could almost refer to these as heptadic novels. And so I came back and I had written the repetition of the word snow on this first page and put a question mark because I like to load questions, observations, things in my mind. And when I write them out and record them in the book and thus have a conversation with the book, I carry that forward with me throughout. And it just becomes an accumulation. And it makes all of the text more consequential to me. But after I realized the number 7 was repeating throughout the book, I came back and counted all of those occurrences of the word snow. And wouldn't you know it, but there are exactly 7 of them. And then we move into the very first episode with the kid. And specifically, it's the thalidomide kid. I don't know if I'm saying that right or not, but I had to look that up. I didn't know what thalidomide was. And it turns out it's a sedative drug used to relieve pregnancy nausea, but caused a worldwide tragedy from irreversible damages to the fetus and thousands of children born with congenital malformations. Hence, later on, he refers to himself as the ectromelic hallucination. It comes up on the next page. And ectromelic means absence or imperfection of one or more limbs. Here it's used to explain his epithet, the ectromelic hallucination, as the thalidomide kid. So he is presenting himself using the name of this drug that traces back to a German company and causes these malformations, these defections in the born children. And as we go on, he says, what, are we completely out of Zyklon B? And this is a cyanide-based pesticide. And it happens to be, again, from a German pharmaceutical company. So this is 2 references within the first few pages of this episode that are pointing to these tragedies or these unintended or overlooked issues stemming from a German pharmaceutical company. So again, it's putting pinch on my mind. I also noticed that there was this overwrought theatrical scene that just becomes increasingly absurd. And in fact, I didn't really catch on for the first few pages. But then as it progressed, I just thought, what is this nightmare? This just almost slapstick in places. And in fact, there is a moment when it says that the kid skated to the door in a long glissade. And I had to look that up, and it's a movement from ballet. And it's a very theatrical, silly looking movement. And it just seems so out of place here. But when I realized that glissade was what it is, I realized, oh, this is just a theater. This is a theater of the absurd. McCarthy packs so much in here that it's like he's spreading seed for his critics. Maybe seed that leads to nowhere, and maybe seed that will keep especially Freudian critics busy for a lifetime. But I had to question, why so dense and intricate a set here? McCarthy, ever with a knack for description, says that slowly rubbing his small, scarred head, he looked like he'd been brought into the world with ice tongs. And he's packed with knowledge, but he doesn't really know how to employ it properly. So what we end up with, because these scenes will kick off every single chapter. So every chapter is made up of first an italicized scene between the sister character, whom we come to know as Alicia Western, and the kid, and then a section non-italicized with her brother Bobby Western. But what happens is that he just ends up spouting all these malapropisms and solecisms, and he tries all these different plays on words and puns and alliterations, and it's just absurd. We get a ton of allusions to what will be something that presides over both books, and that is mathematics. And right here in the beginning, we see the kid say, "You don't know what's in the offing, do you? You'll pardon the pun." This is our first alert that she is contemplating suicide, and then he reminds her that she has called him a spectral operator, and we find that this comes from mathematics. We get another amazing description. It says, "The kid arched one moth-gnawn eyebrow." He alludes to Plato's cave. He says feet and the shadow of feet, just like in the real world. And feet and the shadow of feet, just like in the real world, not only does that allude, I think, to Plato's cave with the fire and the shadow from the fire dancing on the walls of the cave, but there is a penumbra there. So you've got a figure standing, casting a shadow. That edge where the figure and the shadow it's casting meet, or when there is an eclipse and you can see the outline where it hasn't totally eclipsed yet, that penumbra is where McCarthy will reside in so much of these two novels, and where he will place us. We also get this really interesting reference to logic, where the kid says, "Well, just remember whose hand is on the NAND gate, ducky." And it's all lowercase and it's a compound. So if you're not familiar with logic and with logical gates, you may not catch it. But this is in mathematical logic. There are these operators, and a NAND gate would be a not and gate. So anding two things together is to combine them. Not and is not to combine them. But this is another tip to us that mathematics is coming into play big time in these novels. We also see that Alicia is given to constantly correcting him. She's, like Bobby, she's extremely perspicacious and punctilious. We get a reference to running a Monte Carlo, which is an algorithm that uses repeated random sampling to obtain probabilistic results. We see a repetition just like on the very first page where it says Christmas. It is Christmas, almost. And so that's an indication that this is now taking place before what took place on the opening page. And I like that repetition repeated. We get a pantograph and a limnoscate. Pantograph is a device built on a parallelogram design such that movements on one side create the mirror movements on the other side. And so it looks like what he's referring to is a figure eight shape, a limnoscate, such as infinity. And then we come out of that heavily elusive and packed and theatrical Pynchon-esque section into the very first time with Bobby, and he is a deep sea diver. He's a salvage diver. And we get this beautiful sentence with this procession of W's. Western watched the tender, and he blew on the tea and sipped it, and he watched the lights moving along the causeway like the slow cellular crawl of water drops on a wire. And we'll see this repeated imagery using wires and water drops and things creeping slowly along wires and lines on page 48. They rose from the couch simultaneously, like birds leaving a wire. This group of acquaintances that Bobby is hanging around with at these bars are clearly very, very learned. Within a few moments, we get Unamuno, Rilke, Asclepius. We also see a reference to Oak Ridge in Tennessee, which it's really interesting. And this is why in my video on Brian Clegg's quantum computing, I said that reading a lot of nonfiction will only enhance your reading of fiction. And it just so happens that that book on quantum computing sort of had a bunch of different refreshers on quantum mechanics and on fun facts about computers, relevant facts. And one of them was that the fastest non-quantum computer in the world right now is indeed in Oak Ridge. It's called Frontier. On page 52, in the midst of the kid and his crazy rantings and performances, he says, "Nothing to be done." And that immediately struck me as being the refrain from Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. Rien à faire, rien à faire. And so I underlined that and I put a little note in the margin saying, does this repeat? And it never did repeat again, but I still feel like that's probably an allusion to Beckett and to Waiting for Godot. We see that Bobby is, again, just as punctilious, as pedantic as his sister, and we see him correcting pronunciation, just like his sister corrects the kid's grammar. And so when someone says, "You're not going to be dour, are you?" And I read that in my brain voice as dour. And he says, "Doer." Doer? The preferred, I believe. You don't mind me telling you? No, of course not. Doer. Actually, I like that better. I'm a sucker for little things like that. Now, when I got to chapter 3 on page 72, I started to catch on to something that I noticed at first and thought it was just classic McCarthy idiosyncratic vernacular style. But I noticed that, for example, when it says, "Where have you been?" there is an apostrophe in whereof to contract "where have you been?" Or "that's a bit late." There is an apostrophe in that's to contract that and is. However, when it comes to can't or don't or doesn't or couldn't or didn't, there is never an apostrophe. And this holds true throughout the entire book of The Passenger and Stella Maris. And I'm still not 100% sure what to make of that, if anything. Perhaps it is just a stylistic thing, but to have only the negatively contracted words or negative contractions or contractions of negatives omitting the apostrophe, but not any of the others, I find that too deliberate to not be by design. And it makes me think again about logic and about NAND gates and NOR gates and about not, or in programming, a bang character, which is an exclamation mark. We get another reference to German culture, Liederkranz, which means wreath of songs, German singing society. And I noted why so many references to German culture. And it could purely be the fact that we have in these novels the advent of the atom bomb coming out of the Manhattan Project, which had many different German names associated with it. But it could simply be, too, that because Bobby and Alicia's parents are both scientists, or were both scientists who worked on different things around the uranium and around basically the atom bomb, they mingled with and brushed up against a lot of German culture. On page 85, when Western checks into a room there above one of the bars, he picked up the brass fob in his palm and looked at the room number, and it was number 7. And then he says, lucky 7. And again, on page 88, it says, by the time he left, it was almost 7 o'clock, and he walked back to the 7 C's. And it was at that moment that I realized this is a heptadic novel. This is a novel that's braced in mathematical numerology. There's also this scene where Bobby suspects that because of this salvage dive that he did with a friend, I think it was Euler, they've got someone or some people following them, and it's making him a little bit paranoid. And in this one scene, it says that he left a round ballpoint pen in the center of the drawer, this bathroom drawer, with the cap off so that it would roll. And when he eased the drawer open, the pen was lying against the front of it. And this is a really clever way of seeing if someone's been in his room tampering with things. But it also, once again, gives this Pynchonian paranoia on top of all the Pynchonian cultural references and allusions. On page 91, this is just a beautiful sentence. They motored out past the pilings, dark with pitch, and trailing a green scurf in the clay-colored water. I lingered over this sentence for way longer than is probably necessary, but it just seems so beautiful to me. You heard those plosives of all the P words in there, but we've also got these echo pairs, such as motored and clay-colored, pilings and trailing, past pilings and pitch. Not to mention, just like that perfect verb on the very first page, stogged, for talking about how the hunter put his gun into the snow, the butt down into the snow, stogged it there. Again, we get this word scurf, trailing a green scurf. This happens again and again with all of McCarthy, really. He finds the perfect word, the mot juste, over and over. This is the very beginning of chapter 4, and it says, swinging its head on its scrannel neck in the black iron collar it wore. Scrannel means slight, thin, or lean. So, I mean, how much better is that? Instead of saying swinging its head on its thin neck in the black iron collar it wore, McCarthy gives us one of those grab the reader's attention words, swinging its head on its scrannel neck. On page 108, Alicia introduces us to what is the first of many references to Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, but she makes it more personal, and she refers to an auto-archon. So the archons are familiar figures from Kabbalah, but here, auto, this means autonomous, or it could mean I, something coming from me, such as autobiography. Because again, at this point, we're starting to pick up on the fact that Alicia is clearly schizophrenic, or is being presented as such, and she knows it. She's well aware of it, and we begin to see these italicized sections as the theater of Alicia's mind. Here's another eye-catching word. On page 111, I try to avoid that. As a strap hanger, my feet terminate about a foot shy of the floor. And I figured that strap hanger was just one of these compound words where the hyphen is omitted so that it gives it a more Joycean flavor and appeal. But I looked it up, and it does mean a passenger on a bus or train, such as hanging from the straps in there. But when I read that, I said, wait a minute, the passenger. And I realized that over and over and over, the title of the book, the theme of the passenger, is being referred to and played with. Is the kid Alicia's passenger or dark passenger from psychology? Are we the passengers? And there again, with the story of Bobby, which occurs in the future after Alicia's death, as the salvage diver, he encounters, after his dive and reconnaissance on this submerged plane, he encounters a missing passenger. And this is why the government or some agency is after him. And he even goes out on a little boat and finds an island where this passenger who was on that plane looks to have escaped and fled. So we've got these loose figures all over, and it creates this mystery and this paranoia. Now, let me just say that by the time I got to the end of this book and then the end of Stella Maris, I realized that there is a lot that is left unclosed. There are a lot of holes, a lot of conjecture, a lot of hintings. I love that. I am not someone who needs a perfect little plot where every single thread is neatly closed and tied with a bow on it. I don't need that. If it happens, great. I hope the writing's really good too. But I almost enjoy being in that tension, that penumbra of tension and uncertainty, more than outside of it. And this is something that McCarthy gives us and furthermore sustains throughout the whole book. Something strange went awry in this submerged plane. Someone is after Bobby. There's more to Alicia's death. There's more to, clearly, the relationship between Bobby and Alicia. There is some passenger out there on the loose. But it's like McCarthy presents all these things to us and gives us what could be seen as a whodunit novel here at the beginning. But then he, little by little, starts to show us indirectly that none of those things are things that really matter. Is this laziness? No. McCarthy, at this point, at 89 years old and with so many incredible novels, McCarthy is cemented as a master novelist. He is well aware of what he has done here. That cannot be contested. But I argue that he's setting us up for this world in which Alicia most explicitly lives. And that is the world of the mathematical mind. And he's laying all the foundation for us and sort of prepping us in The Passenger for what we'll get in the breathtaking and stunning Stella Maris. As I told a guy who's been reading this along with me, a good friend of mine, and we've been just sort of texting back and forth, because I had gotten to Stella Maris first, I said, hey, if The Passenger is a joint, Stella Maris is a line of pure cocaine. But in any case, I don't think most of us could go straight to Stella Maris just on its own. And while I certainly would enjoy the mental gymnastics and thought experiments and so on that reminded me of The Sunset Limited, but in a different capacity, the majority of people would dismiss Stella Maris on its own. However, everything in The Passenger is prepping us for a sublime experience in Stella Maris, because he's bringing our emotions along, he's bringing our intellect along, he's putting things in front of us and then denying them to us to set our expectations properly. And he's giving us the story up here ahead, so that when we go back 8 years and we start to get this filling in, it will be that much more powerful and compound. But I'll refrain from Stella Maris until we get there. On page 113, the purpose of all families in their lives and in their deaths is to create the traitor who will finally erase their history forever. And it's one of these beautiful sentences that has the aphoristic quality to it that I like. But it has also really stayed with me and made me question who that traitor is in the Western family. In the next paragraph on that same page, or 2 paragraphs later, we get the word Vergangenheitvolk, which means people from the past. And once again, it's a German word. We start to get some more of the story behind Alicia and Bobby, and we start to find some things out that I flipped back to the front and I noted, because once I saw that the book was alternating between their 2 stories, Alicia's and Bobby's, I made these 2 columns, one for the kid and the sister, and then one for Bobby Western. And at first I wondered if Bobby Western were just a nickname, but then I realized that it isn't later in the book. And we don't even know that the sister's name is Alicia until page 103. But obviously the sister is appearing to become increasingly schizophrenic. She is a mathematics genius. Bobby started also studying mathematics, but he switched his major to physics. And as it is given to us on page 126, Bobby had seen briefly into the deep heart of number, and he knew that world would be forever closed to him. So he switched to physics, just like his father. However, Alicia is the true mathematician, and she stuck with it. And she goes to the very edge. We see also that Bobby at one point took off to Europe to be a Formula 2 driver and got into a horrific accident and was in a coma. Another German reference here is to Gabelsberger, which is this shorthand that was created in the 19th century by Franz Xavier Gabelsberger. And it was previously very common shorthand in Austria and Germany. And of course, Alicia taught it to herself, and apparently Gödel used it as well. And she taught it to herself to be able to read the notes from Kurt Gödel. So, a lot of the German influence is also because of the German-Austrian advances in mathematics and philosophy and physics, which all feature heavily in these books. I love the way, too, that we only get glimpses of Alicia in The Passenger. Alicia happens to be the most interesting, most enigmatic character in the whole book. And so it's such a treat that she'll be focused on exclusively in Stella Maris. But we get a couple of moments of her thinking and insight into Alicia's world. She says, "You will never know what the world is made of." She's talking to the kid. "The only thing that's certain is that it's not made of the world. As you close upon some mathematical description of reality, you can't help but lose what is being described. Every inquiry displaces what is addressed. A moment in time is a fact, not a possibility. The world will take your life. But above all and lastly, the world does not know that you are here. You think that you understand this, but you don't. Not in your heart you don't. If you did, you would be terrified. And you're not. Not yet." We get a glimpse of her talking to a Dr. Sussman on page 131, and he says, "I'm Dr. Sussman. Why are you by yourself?" And she says, "I'm not by myself. I'm schizophrenic." And this is not our first intimation of her wry humor, but it's a glimpse at the beautiful character of Alicia. I'm going to read this whole passage on 137 because it's so perfect. This is a conversation between a figure named Shedden and Bobby. They've long known each other. They're good friends. And Shedden says to Bobby, "I think you've some idea. I know that you think we're very different, me and thee. My father was a country storekeeper and yours a fabricator of expensive devices that make a loud noise and vaporize people, that is, the atom bomb. But our common history transcends much. I know you. I know certain days of your childhood, all but weeping with loneliness, coming upon a certain book in the library and clutching it to you, carrying it home, some perfect place to read it, under a tree perhaps, beside a stream, flawed youths, of course, to prefer a world of paper, and to prefer a world of paper." That's a great summation of a bookworm. But we know another truth, don't we, Squire? And of course, it's true that any number of these books were penned in lieu of burning down the world, which was their author's true desire. But the real question is, are we few the last of a lineage? Will children yet to come harbor a longing for a thing they cannot even name? The legacy of the word is a fragile thing for all its power. But I know where you stand, Squire. I know that there are words spoken by men ages dead that will never leave your heart. Ah, the waiter. There's a few things going on here. First of all, that bathos of the final sentence, where we've been in this sublime arc, and then all of a sudden harsh and banal reality intrudes. Ah, the waiter's here, because they're at a bar and he's about to order. But that penultimate sentence is such a beautiful summation of everything that came before it. The legacy of the word is a fragile thing for all its power. But I know where you stand, Squire. I know that there are words spoken by men ages dead that will never leave your heart. And then that last sentence, that snap back to plain reality. But it also intimates at the logos, the word that can create the world. We get an allusion to a Robert Burns poem from 1794. He says, "Your love is not so likely to resemble a red, red rose as a red, red rash." And it's a fun little play on that poem. This one sentence on 147, it says, "The road to reality may well unravel fresh rules as it goes." That road to infinity made me think of The Road to Reality by Roger Penrose, who is a Platonic mathematician. This will come up a lot in these two books. The idea that mathematics represents a real realm out there in reality, that numbers and equations, math, has Platonic forms. We can't see them or get to them, but we see their shadow and their instantiations and manifestations. Some of the difficulty with quantum mechanics has to reside in the problem of coming to terms with the simple fact that there is no such thing as information in and of itself, independent of the apparatus necessary to its perception. There were no starry skies prior to the first sentient and ocular being to behold them. And when I read that in Starry Skies, I immediately put, reference to Kant's quote about the only two things that occupied him were the starry skies above him and the moral code within him. And then, not but a few exchanges later, we get Kant's view of quantum mechanics, and I quote, "is that which is not adapted to our powers of cognition." And so this is Kant's view of quantum mechanics. He is questioning this in an anachronistic matter, because of course Immanuel Quantum, Kant didn't know about quantum mechanics, so this is a winking anachronism. Nonetheless, between the last two passages that I've read, we see lots of paradoxes will come up, but the self-referential and the ability to stand outside of something in which we're contained is an ongoing theme, hence that penumbra of tension that I think is a great symbol and image for these books. Again and again, you'll hear about mathematicians, physicists who see this Platonic world out there, and then others who don't. There can't be anything there to them. There's just an abyss. However, with the things that we've seen in mathematics, in quantum physics, there is something that is spooky that goes on in the processes and materials that make up reality. Mathematics is a dimension that we have not seen, at least not to this degree, in McCarthy before. You can sense that one of the things he wanted to do in these books is capture the consciousness of someone whose mind has gone as far into a mathematical reality as possible. Page 154, "The history of physics is full of people who gave it up and went on to do something else. With few exceptions, they have one thing in common, which is they weren't good enough. And you? I was okay. I could do it, just not at the level where it really mattered." And this is an exchange with Bobby. And Bobby's saying that he gave up physics because he was good at it, but he was not at the level where it mattered. And that's the interesting thing about the field of quantum physics, of mathematics, is that if you're just okay, it's not really going to advance anything. One needs the Einsteins, one needs the Freges, one needs the Gödels, one needs the Oppenheimers. Here's some of his classic, beautiful imagery on 178. "Everything had a gray and abandoned look to it. He drove out the Alcoa highway and pushed the car to 150, trailing a thin rooster tail of water vapor in his wake." We've already been told at the beginning of this paragraph he drove into Knoxville, a gray and rainy day. So we know that it's rainy. But that image of getting in this Maserati and going 150 down a highway, a trail of a thin rooster tail of water vapor in his wake. I notice on page 184, we get the word penetralium. And I don't think I've seen penetralium or penetralium in any other book except the very beginning of Wuthering Heights, where coming into contact with that word first struck me. Here we go. The very beginning of chapter 6 on page 188, the very end of it says, "Something on the road, something coming, some sweat-soaked beast, some hooded and wheezing abhorrence, a trundle upon the footpath. Just the faintest movement of the air like a gradient of ill come unshelved and drifting toward her lonely outpost." This is, what an amazing writer. And we get this crescendo something on the road, something coming, some sweat-soaked beast, some hooded and wheezing abhorrence a trundle on the footpath, with the something or some as this repetition, and then the apotheosis of the passage, just the faintest movement of the air, like a gradient of ill, come unshelved and drifting toward her lonely outpost. Here's the kid and Alicia. Take a bunch of stills and run them tandem at a certain speed, and what is this that looks like life? Well, it's an illusion. And earlier, the kid and Alicia mused on whether there really could be such a thing as static moments or not. Here, the kid is giving me the idea of, well, the way movies, I was going to say a flip book operates, where it's a bunch of static pages and you flip it and it gives the sense of a continuous, unbroken movement. So we have this question, is life a series of static, discrete moments? Or is it just one ongoing blob or stream? We get an allusion to Helen of Troy. It says, the loss of a great beauty can bring an entire nation to its knees. Nothing else can do that. And then the person talking says, Helen? And the other person says, or Marilyn Monroe, presumably. But of course, we know from the Iliad that Helen of Troy had the face that launched 1,000 ships. And this is one of many references to Alicia's incredible beauty, her incredible physical appearance. And so in one person, that person being Alicia Western, McCarthy has put in an intense aesthetic beauty and an intense intellectual beauty. And yet the beauty isn't because of perfection. Her mind and her personage are so beautiful and alluring, I believe, because of the underpinning tragedy of the schizophrenia, the wounded warrior, the suffering saint. Now let's switch over and just look at the way that in one sentence, Cormac McCarthy can capture the whole atmosphere and tone of a scene. And we're in this dilapidated shanty, and it says, sink so full of dishes you got to go outside to take a leak. And then check out this visual. Western took a drink and passed the bottle back. Borman drank. The brown liquor boiled in the bottle. And at first I thought, boiled in the bottle, but then I realized he has turned the bottle upside down like this, and the way that it's coming through, it's causing the top of the liquid to jump around. McCarthy is, of course, incredibly notable for capturing dialogue, that very terse, pithy dialogue, but also the hard scrabble way of talking, such as this exchange. Was drinking a problem? I don't know. I guess I'd have to say it was. I'd wake up in strange places. I woke up one time in somebody's parked car and I thought, well, what if you woke up dead? That kind of got to me. I mean, do you think if you died drunk, you'd sober up before you met Jesus? Good question. I don't know. I thought about that, standing in front of him drunk. What would he say? Hell, what would you say? I guess I don't think your soul gets drunk. Webb thought about that. Well, he said, maybe yours don't. Here's another exchange. If someone said to you that you had thrown your life away over a woman, what would you say? Well thrown. For all his dedication, there were times when he thought the fine, sweet edge of his grief was thinning. This grief is over the death of his sister. And at this point, we pretty much know that they were in love with each other. And furthermore, I tend to wonder if they're not the two halves of the tree from the ancient Greek thought that everybody's born looking for the other half to complete themselves. And of course, McCarthy is no stranger to taboo, and so he's thinking, hey, what if those two halves ended up being biological siblings? But anyway, it says, for all his dedication, there were times he thought the fine, sweet edge of his grief was thinning. Each memory but a memory of the one before until, what? Host and sorrow to waste as one without distinction, until the wretched coagulant is shoveled into the ground at last and the rain primes the stones for fresh tragedies. What to even say to such beautiful prose? On page 269, we get a reference to a letter that Bobby has never opened. And I put a little note, when will this resurface? And in fact, it does resurface by the end of this book. Although Bobby himself can't read it, he has to get someone else to read it on his behalf and just give him a little bit. And this is just one of many ways that McCarthy shows us the intense, entangled feelings for one another the siblings had. And when he's asked why he hasn't read this last letter, he's told, it's because then you would know everything that you will ever know. As long as you haven't read the last letter, the story's not over. That's exactly what I've been trying to say about these books that make them work so well. In a sense, what McCarthy has done with these two books is that he has given us everything except for one letter, one last piece of that puzzle. And withholding it from us makes sure that this story will never be over. McCarthy knows how to set a scene, and he knows how to describe a landscape. The moon rose over the Gulf, that is the Gulf of Mexico, and the moon's path dished and tilted on the water. He makes sure that you can see these things in motion. It's not just a static picture. In this one moment on 280, we suddenly get the kid and Bobby, their worlds coming together. And the kid says, we don't make the people, we just make the templates. It's a file, that's all. So there's this idea that lots of different people have, including Daniel Dennett, that people, consciousness even, is just data. It can be a file on a computer. Bobby says, are you saying that the only difference between her, Alicia, and everybody else is that you don't have a template for her? And he says, no, you are. That's what the kid says back, and the emphasis is on you. And so that's when I first started wondering about them, Alicia and Bobby, being the two halves of that proverbial tree. At the same time, man, you got to wonder what that means. And a lot of stuff that's coming up, especially in Stella Maris, makes you wonder just how far into that world of reality and human beings and human consciousness as pure data, how far into that McCarthy is really trying to go. I'm going to read this whole passage on page 297. It's not just that I don't have to write things down. There's more to it than that. This is Alicia. What you write down becomes fixed. It takes on the constraints of any tangible entity. It collapses into a reality estranged from the realm of its creation. It's a marker, a road sign. You have stopped to get your bearings, but at a price. You'll never know where it might have gone if you'd left it alone to go there. In any conjecture, you're always looking for a weakness. But sometimes you have the sense that you should hold off, be patient, have a little faith. You really want to see what the conjecture itself is going to drag up out of the murk. I don't know how one does mathematics. I don't know that there is a way. The idea is always struggling against its own realization. That's so beautifully put. Ideas come with an innate skepticism. They don't just go barreling ahead. And these doubts have their origin in the same world as the idea itself. And that's not something you really have access to. So the reservations that you yourself in the world of struggle bring to the table may actually be alien to the path of these emerging structures. Their own intrinsic doubts are steering mechanisms, while yours are more like brakes. Of course, the idea is going to come to an end anyway. Once a mathematical conjecture is formalized into a theory, it may have a certain luster to it, but with rare exceptions, you can no longer entertain the illusion that it holds some deep insight into the core of reality. It has in fact begun to look like a tool. This is a glimpse of what we're going to get constantly in Stella Maris. McCarthy has really outdone himself in creating a character with a mathematical mind. And then here's a single sentence that can sum up a lot of the different things that I've opened up so far. The problem is that what drives the tale will not survive the tale. This is also a hint at our unconscious. And we'll start to get a lot of insight into the idea that our unconscious, free from languages, artificial languages restrictions, seems to understand math at an innate, unverbalized level. It's even hard for me to talk about and to put into words. But you'll see that McCarthy has labored over articulating so many of these sublime thoughts. Here's a good little exchange. You told me one time that it was almost impossible to fake a death. That's been my experience. Of course, you only hear from the failures. There's this constant wry, sardonic humor, black humor, gallows humor, such as this exchange again in the same section. I should have killed myself years ago. Why didn't you? Because I have no sense of humor. In the morning, he sat with his feet crossed under him and watched the sun rise. It sat swagged and red in the smoke like a matrix of molten iron swung wobbling up out of a furnace. McCarthy knows how to describe the way the sun looks over and over, better than most people can talk about anything. Okay, here we go. This is just passages. In fact, this whole section late in The Passenger, where Bobby is on the lam and he's hiding out in this old abandoned farmhouse. This whole section is so searingly gorgeous. How can someone write about despair and hopelessness and loneliness in a way that's so consoling and comforting? This is just taken from page 312. I'll just read a couple paragraphs here. He bathed in a creek that ran beneath the road, an old concrete bridge, the rebar showing through the rails. He stood naked and shivering on a gravel bar downstream and toweled himself off. The water was cold and clear in the pool below the bridge. Good smallmouth water. He slept that night again in the truck and woke in a milky light where the glass was sifted over with a thin skift of snow. I could just read McCarthy describing anything forever. He sat with his sock feet in the sleeping bag and started the engine and turned on the wipers. Gray daylight and a distant circling of birds rising up out of the river basin a mile away. The thin cranking of their calls. A lone truck was coming up the highway, droning on the grade. He leaned and opened the glove box and took out a package of crackers and tore it open with his teeth and sat eating the crackers and waiting for the engine to warm. So we get this sentence that is a subject with no predicate, then another sentence that's a predicate with no subject, and then it ends with this sort of exhalation of parataxis after that buildup of fragments. Peasants cross the road with their heads bowed like wrongdoers. It's got those biblical prose properties. As I was thinking about McCarthy's writing coming out of all this section that I've been talking about, on the next page on 313, towards the end, he finds 2 boxes of paperback books, and it says Victorian novels that he hadn't read and wouldn't, but also a good collection of poetry and Shakespeare and a Homer and a Bible. And it seems to me that these are the very books that McCarthy has fed on and that have nourished him for his long life. Poetry, Shakespeare, Homer, and the Bible. When he describes 2 owls in a barn at night, he says 2 heart-shaped faces peered down, pale as apple halves in the light. And apple halves is compound word, no hyphen. To echo heart-shaped, yes, but also what a perfect picture. Picture an owl up in an eave of a barn and picture their faces. Pale as apple halves. I've never thought to compare their faces to apple halves. Here's some book love. Shedden, his friend, said once that having read a few dozen books in common was more binding than blood. Meaning, if you and I read a few dozen of the same books together, that will be more binding to us than blood. And just as I suspected the allusion to Kant earlier, here, a couple hundred pages later, it says Kant had it right about the stars above and the truth within. That's the second occurrence then of that anecdote about Kant. As the book starts to come to a close, we get more acquainted with Alicia's thinking. She says, I think a lot of people would elect to be dead if they didn't have to die. Later she says, history is a collection of paper, a few fading recollections. Again, we get another allusion to Jewish mysticism, to Kabbalah. It says it could be that some part of our understanding comes in vessels incapable of sustaining themselves. So this alludes to, and often alluded to in literature, conception of these broken vessels and our life's work as trying to repair them and repair and restore the light. We get a letter from Bobby's friend John that has some of these final thoughts. He's on his deathbed, and some of these final thoughts coincide with a lot of the book too. He says, "Wherever you debark was the train's destination all along. I've studied much and learned little. More time would change nothing, and that which you are poised to relinquish forever almost certainly was never what you thought it to be in the first place. I have never understood in the slightest while I was here. But suffering is a part of the human condition and must be borne. But misery is a choice." And we'll see that one of the reasons Alicia's character is so troubling yet also so charismatic and appealing is because she chooses not to be miserable, though she suffers much. Towards the very end, we get Alicia. She called and told her grandmother she was coming. And then later it says it had snowed and she walked in the woods. And that to me triggered Red Riding Hood. She's going through the woods to get to grandmother's house. And then in 2 pages from here, the wolves will appear. Waiting for the wolves. And then a little bit later down off of that on page 351, "Safe babies," she said. "Oh, how one would like to believe in such a thing." In other words, this is a very dangerous world, especially for the helpless and innocent. We'll get a lot more about babies and about their possible experience in Stella Maris. And this book ends with a 10th chapter, whereas Stella Maris, behold, will have 7 chapters. There's that number again. This final 10th chapter is the only chapter that doesn't begin with a flashback to Alicia and the kid. And we get some German here, and I don't really do German very well, but it says, "Vor mir keine Zeit, nach mir wird keine sein." And this is from a German poet, Daniel von Reigersfeld, and it means, "Before me there was no time, after me there will be none." I loved this word, planished, on page 365. There was an iron lock to the heavy wooden door and a black iron hand-forged key, planished with hammer marks. Once again, the mot juste. Page 366. He sat with the blanket around him and watched the distant dark of the sea, with its shifting cape of stars where they lifted and fell. It came again, the pale ignition of a storm that shaped out the window and cast it brief and shuddering upon the farther wall. A sheet of light flaring silently over the storied sea. The thunderheads along the horizon, shaped in the rim lightning and the slow leaden lap like slag in a vat and the slight smell of ozone. Brief season of storms. He slept to the patter of raindrops on the tarp overhead, and when he woke, it was day. I mean, these passages. And now he is on an island off the coast of Italy, hiding out. And some of these passages are biblical. They're like sacred writing. And again, these incredible similes. In the distance, the thunder rolled across the dark horizon with a sound like boxes falling. You can hear that, and you just know that he got it right. On the penultimate page, "In the end," she said, "there will be nothing that cannot be simulated. And this will be the final abridgment of privilege. This is the world to come, not some other. The only alternate is the surprise in those antic shapes burned into the concrete." And so these are just some running notes while I was reading The Passenger. A couple of questions that are still in my mind. Will mathematics and physics lead us to a real understanding of reality? And 2, is there a God? And where is that God's place in a mathematical universe? Who is the unmoved mover, as Aristotle called it? Why does the concept of faith and the spiritual cause such consternation in the scientific community, yet seems constantly inevitable? As Alicia will say, there are some things that you just have to believe when it comes to math. I found that McCarthy sheared away as much syntax as possible to get the prose to yield a different set of mannerisms. That's the best way I can describe the look of the prose on the page. Very spare, very sparse, shorn of so much syntax. It's mostly dialogue, but McCarthy in The Sunset Limited and others has already proven what he can get out of dialogue. And it's more than most novelists can get out of narrative. Again, the kid strikes me as a Pynchonian character who has somehow stumbled out of one of Pynchon's novels and onto the pages of McCarthy's realm. Early on in that opening, crazy, absurd episode between the kid and Alicia, I thought where we were going to go with this is a Faustian bargain with Alicia as Faust and the kid as Mephistopheles. It occurred to me on further thinking about how to describe this prose that makes sense in the context of the novel, that the prose itself is schizophrenic. I appreciate a book, again, without closure. I appreciate the novels of ideas. It creates in us an ongoing, perpetual motion machine of spiraling moments. Now, let's move on to Stella Maris. Stella Maris, like I said, is composed of 7 chapters. It is about half the size of The Passenger. And these chapters are simply a series of dialogues between Alicia and her psychiatrist there at the facility in Wisconsin called Stella Maris. And this is happening 8 years before the present tense events that are going on in The Passenger. So we're backing up here. And I'm delighted that we are because, like I said, McCarthy in The Passenger has already so invested us in Alicia's story and in this relationship between her and her brother. She is breathtakingly erudite. She studied topology and topos theory in mathematics. And this may be a book that contains the best sardonic humor I've ever read in my life. In the midst of her schizophrenia, her deep insight into every discipline out there, history, mathematics, literature, she quotes Montaigne at the same time that she digs into Euclid. I also find a continuation of the number 7. Not only are there 7 chapters in here, but we find out that there are 7 years in age between Bobby and Alicia, he being the older sibling. And as this book unfolds, what I began to see was that The Passenger and Stella Maris are also books about the lives of 2 children of scientists who helped create the atom bomb. And so we're looking at what could be seen as inherited guilt in a successive generation, post-war generation, along the lines of what Wolfgang Hilbig does and Viggy Sebald. Because this is completely dialogue, and again, McCarthy is a master of dialogue, I began to see it as a continuation of Plato's dialogues, because the questions here are just as deep and just as urgent and monumental as they were in Plato's time. It also reminded me of another book that's mostly dialogue and on the big questions, Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. I think that's his name. I know his last name is Quinn, but you should seek that book out if you like The Sunset Limited, if you like Stella Maris. Check out Quinn's Ishmael. I think it's actually one in a trilogy. On page 13, when she says, approaching Euler, I think that's how you spell that. It looks like Euler, but I remember in my calculus classes, my professor saying, no, it's pronounced Euler. And then it occurred to me, I wonder if Bobby's friend Euler, who died in The Passenger, if that was a play on Euler, the mathematician. Alicia says, intelligence is numbers. It's not words. Words are things we've made up. Mathematics is not. And so this is so welcome because even things that I don't believe or that chafe me or rub me the wrong way come up. I like being presented with it. I like being provoked. And I love that McCarthy is taking time to present the way the world is seen and felt by someone who believes like this. And this is a big step for McCarthy. McCarthy famously is not really adept at female characters. And I can't recall him going this deep into math or physics before. And so at 89 years old, and with a very luminous career, McCarthy is not taking it easy. He is still pouring himself out, expending himself to give us something like this. He is determined to keep pushing the limits as far as they can go. She mentions that she spent a certain amount of time on game theory. There's something seductive about it, she says. I know very little about game theory, but I did notice that Brian Clegg, whose book Quantum Computing I recently read, came out with a book on game theory last year, so I quickly acquired it. On page 24, she says, "The world has created no living thing that it does not intend to destroy." This is a typical view of a McCarthyian world. The psychiatrist says, "Was this part of the spiritual crisis that you spoke of?" She says, "It's just a commentary. The spiritual nature of reality has been the principal occupation of mankind since forever, and it's not going away anytime soon. The notion that everything is just stuff doesn't seem to do it for us." In other words, materialism doesn't just seem to do it for us because it hasn't silenced the Cartesians, I guess. This is such a great statement. I came to see the world as pretty much proof against any comprehensive description of it. We cannot give a comprehensive description of something within which we are contained. Nonetheless, many different people, and in these two books you get a veritable history of mathematics, history of physics. Many of these people will not stop trying, even if they know that you can't make a comprehensive, all-encompassing, all-explanatory statement about the world, the reality that we're in. They're not going to stop trying. And this is the same effort we get on the part of a novelist from McCarthy. He appears through his books to have a burning desire to touch something sublime, something like a Platonic ideal. And though he fail, he will never stop trying. And I think I've said in other places about how the best books come out of an artist trying to extend slightly beyond their grasp. That sentiment is completely validated by these two books. I love when Alicia talks about music. The therapist says, "So where does music come from?" She says, "No one knows. A Platonic theory of music just muddies the water. Music is made out of nothing but some fairly simple rules. Yet it's true that no one made them up. The rules. The notes themselves amount to almost nothing. But why some particular arrangement of these notes should have such a profound effect on our emotions is a mystery beyond even the hope of comprehension. Music is not a language. It has no reference to anything other than itself. You can name the notes with the letters of the alphabet if you like, but it doesn't change anything. Oddly, they are not abstractions. Is music as we know it complete? In what sense? Are there classes such as major and minor we've yet to discover? It seems unlikely, doesn't it? Still, lots of things are unlikely until they appear. And what do these categories signify? Where do they come from? What does it mean that they are two shades of blue, in my eyes? If music was here before we were, for whom was it here? Schopenhauer says somewhere that if the entire universe should vanish, the only thing left would be music. And now here she is on memory. Each memory is the memory of the memory before. You can't remember the occasion of the actual memory. How would you do that? You just remember remembering it. And this is a lot of what Proust and Matei Calinescu in his book Rereading and Proust's On Reading get at when they talk about the memory of reading. She says that she became an overnight solipsist, and to some extent she still is a solipsist. Krafft-Ebing is the German psychiatrist interested in sexual pathology, comes up in here, and it made me think of the way Krafft-Ebing's notorious book showed up just before the most notorious episode in Gravity's Rainbow. On page 61, they start getting into the father's involvement in the building of the bomb as part of the Manhattan Project. She says, "I suppose you want to know if he, my dad, felt guilty about building the bomb. He didn't, but he's dead, and my brother is brain dead, and I'm in the nut house. So we've backed up. I think it's 1972, whereas The Passenger is taking place in 1980. And at this time, she has checked herself in to the Stella Maris institution, and she knows that her brother is in a coma, I think in Italy, because of the Formula 2 crash. But ultimately, we start to get into whether her father felt guilt or felt responsibility for the outcome of what he helped to build. And she says that she doesn't blame her father. And she furthermore says, "My father didn't sleep before the bomb and he didn't sleep after." I think most of the scientists didn't give that much thought to what was going to happen. They were just having a good time. They all said the same thing about the Manhattan Project, that they'd never had so much fun in their lives. And I remember that in Rising Up and Rising Down, William T. Vollmann brought up the notion of the guilt of the scientists on the Manhattan Project. And I made a note to go and find where that is and reacquaint myself with what Vollmann had to say about it. Here's one of a classic comical exchanges between the two. "You were born at Los Alamos." "Yes, Boxing Day, 1951. "Boxing Day? What is that?" "It's the day after Christmas." "Why is it called Boxing Day?" "It's called Boxing Day because that's the day you box up all the crap you got that you don't want and take it back to the store." And he says, "That's not true." She goes, "No, traditionally it's the day when you exchange gifts, boxes of cookies or whatever." This happens a lot. And you can, as the conversations continue, or the dialogues continue, there's such a great dynamic and rapport, and a chemistry that develops between Alicia and the doctor. So in between all the headiness of the subjects and the articulation that's on the edge of comprehension by default because of what they're talking about, there are these great little exchanges and this little humor and these little quips and jabs where they're starting to get acquainted with how each other operates. She talks about a bunch of different great mathematicians. She mentions Cantor, Riemann, Euler, Hilbert, Poincaré, Gauss, von Neumann, and on, Boole, Lagrange, Laplace, Hamilton, Church. And the therapist points out that she forgot to mention one person. She says, "Oh, that's because all the ones I named are dead." He says, "Is that the requirement for greatness?" She says, "It's a requirement for not waking up tomorrow and saying something extraordinarily stupid." "When you're talking about intelligence, you're talking about number," she says. "A claim that the mathless are quick to frown upon. It's about calculation and the nature of calculation. Verbal intelligence will only take you so far. There is a wall there. And even if you don't understand numbers, you won't even see the wall." Of course, one might also add that intelligence is a basic component of evil. The more stupid you are, the less capable you are of doing harm. This showed me just once again how McCarthy was able to really get into the mindset of a female character, but also a mathematician. She says, "Its general vacuity aside, there seems to be a ceiling to well-being. My guess is that you can only be so happy, while there seems to be no floor to sorrow." And ceiling and floor are, even in programming languages, as mathematical terms to give a cap and a bottom, meaning the lowest number and the highest number you can go. But aside from just that and the aesthetic value of what she said, this is something that is particularly McCarthyian. There seems to be a ceiling to well-being. My guess is that you can only be so happy while there seems to be no limit, no floor to sorrow. The therapist says that someone once said the raw material of art is pain. I tried to look that up, and it looks like it might be Jean-Paul Sartre, but I'm not sure. So if someone else knows who said that, please let me know. But let me read this quick exchange because it's really got great food for thought. "Someone once said that the raw material of art is pain. Is that true of music?" "I don't know," Alicia says. "I've never composed music, but I would guess it might be true." "What about mathematics?" her therapist asks. She says, "Mathematics is just sweat and toil. I wish it were romantic. It isn't. At its worst, there are audible suggestions. It's hard to keep up. You don't dare sleep, and you may have been up for 2 days, but that's too bad. You find yourself making a decision and finding 2 more decisions waiting, and then 4, and then 8. You have to force yourself to just stop and go back. Begin again. You're not seeking beauty. You're seeking simplicity. The beauty comes later, after you've made a wreck of yourself. Is it worth it? The therapist asks. And she says, like nothing else on earth. Talking to her therapist about her interactions with the kid, she says, it would be nice to think that there was actual data encoded in these spiels, but I've been listening to them for years, and Turing couldn't untangle them, meaning Alan Turing of the Turing test, to decide whether something is a machine or a human. But this almost felt like McCarthy putting that out there about these books he's created. It would be nice to think that there is actual data encoded in these spiels. But what if there isn't? What if it's just recognitions of knowledge that we've stored up across the ages of humanity that I'm seeing in these things? It's just a world of symbols that has an incredible index of cross-references, but no real meaning or data to be encoded. Again, you get this sense that he's leading us to the edge of everything. If we were constructed with a continual awareness of how we worked, we wouldn't work. You might even ask that if the self is indeed an illusion, for whom then is it illusory? In the same way she was talking about if math was already part of the structure of the universe, it was already out there, then for whom was it out there? When Wittgenstein convinced Russell that all of mathematics was a tautology, Russell gave up mathematics. Is that true? I don't know. Russell said it was. What would be your view? I don't think the question could be answered. For the present, I guess I'd have to say no. But by then, I'd already left the building. And I'm not really sure about this, but it seemed like a subtle reference to Zeno's dichotomy paradox, where you can never actually leave a room because the distance between you and the door can infinitely be subdivided. But that may be overreaching on my part. She strikes a resonant chord with my thoughts exactly here. As with the general run of philosophers, if he is one, and she's talking about Spangler of Decline of the West, the most interesting thing was not his ideas, but just the way his mind worked. This is what I tried to articulate in my video about why I read philosophy. It's not as much about the ideas, it's more about seeing how their minds work, how they get there. The therapist comes to a point towards the end of the book where he asks, is there a single insight that supports most of modern mathematics? She says, oh, this is good. He apologizes. She says, no, it's not a lame question. It's just that we don't know the answer. Things like the deeps of cohomology or Cantor's discontinuum are tainted with the flavor of unguessed worlds. We can see the footprints of algebras whose entire domain is immune to commutation, matrices whose hatchings cast a shadow upon the floor of their origins and leave there an imprint to which they no longer conform. Finally, the therapist says, it's not understood, is it, what mathematics is? No, she says. Will it ever be? No, she says. And on the very last page, we end this whole journey through the passenger and Stella Maris, and especially through Stella Maris, with Alicia asking the therapist to just simply hold her hand. And presumably while they're sitting there holding hands, he asks, why? Why do you want me to hold your hand? And she says, because that's what people do when they're waiting for the end of something. And that is the image we're left with after an incredible journey, a holding of hands and a waiting for something to end. All right, now I have read the 3 reviews that I had been putting off until I had read the novels for myself. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of things I got from them, starting with Michael Gora's review in NYRB, the winter issue from 2022. The title of the piece was Language, Destroyer of Worlds, which is a nod to what Oppenheimer is said to have thought or to have uttered when he saw one of the explosions. And it's a play on what he thought, because what he thought or said comes from the Bhagavad Gita, and it says, I am become death, destroyer of worlds. I also misread this at first as language, destroyer of words, which I thought was really paradoxical and maybe a little more enticing of a title. Gora surveys McCarthy's earlier work, kind of a career overview and a stylistic evolution, development. He also is able to draw parallels with Faulkner. Gora has a great book about the Civil War and Faulkner. And he seeks to show how in The Passenger and Stella Maris, McCarthy is trying something new. In his dotage, in his 90th year, like I said earlier, he's not slowing down. He's still progressing. Immediately as I started reading the review, another number 7 came up, and it was that in that plane that we see submerged off the Gulf of Mexico, there are 7 passengers. Now, the whole thing is that the manifest shows that there were 8. So one passenger is that one that's on the run, that's missing. And in a second, when we talk about Joy Williams's review, she makes a good assessment as to what that passenger really refers to. But in any case, I didn't catch that and tie it in with all the other heptatic elements of the novel. Curiously, no one I've read yet has pointed out this predominance and recurrence of the number 7 in these books. As I suspected, not with Gora specifically, but just of other readers, he admits to being somewhat unsatisfied, to a somewhat unsatisfied curiosity about the abandoned whodunit plot in The Passenger. Nonetheless, he says that The Passenger is expansive, apparently plot-driven, yet also oddly and pleasurably digressive. And the overall tone of all 3 reviews is that McCarthy has done a great work here. It seems that all professional reviewers can't let a single review go by without saying, now there are some problems, and this novel could be a little tighter. And they offer maybe a few paltry reasons why. It's almost like it's mandatory. But the tone of all of them shows me that Gora, Wood, and Williams all enjoyed these novels. Gora points out that he supposes that you could read one novel without the other, The Passenger in particular being able to stand on its own. He says, but I can't imagine that anyone who finishes that book won't want to go on, meaning that if you read The Passenger, there's no way you're not going to be able to go on to Stella Maris. And he says that Stella Maris might even take precedence, the dominant partner in this codependent pair. Of course, he's drawing a parallel between the 2 novels and the 2 codependent siblings. He also draws a parallel, especially in terms of the incest that's never consummated, to Faulkner's Quentin Compton and his sister Caddy, which I totally missed. I was thinking of Renthie and her brother in Outer Dark. But here's what he says of the novels that I really liked. He says they don't distill his earlier achievements as late work so often does. They expand it. So again, this isn't just a capstone or one last offering that an aging novelist ekes out. He also talks about the prose as being mannered. And I recall having the same thought that the prose was mannered, such that he is teasing mannerisms out of the prose that gives the prose that schizophrenic quality I talked about, but also a sort of civility or a sort of code of conduct. McCarthy has long been associated with the Fellows of the Santa Fe Institute, a multidisciplinary think tank. And McCarthy, in his rare interviews, has noted the pleasures and provocations of talking with the Institute's physicists and mathematicians. And this is one thing I didn't know about McCarthy. I don't know a whole lot about McCarthy the man. I've just enjoyed his works. But apparently, ever since the founding in 1984, of the Santa Fe Institute, he has been very closely associated with them and has clearly spent a lot of time with their mathematicians and physicists to bring us these 2 novels. The last thing that Gora said that really stood out to me was that the ideas in Stella Maris are exciting, not just because of the ideas in themselves, but it's because they're hers, meaning they're Alicia's. They are embedded in the drama and struggle of her life. And I think that's very, very well put. The next review I read was the Joy Williams review in Harper's. It is titled Great, Beautiful, Terrifying on Cormac McCarthy, and it appears in their January 2023 issue. Overall, just in general, it was a real treat to read this review written by such a great imaginative writer herself. She focuses on McCarthy's most recent obsession with mathematics, quantum mechanics, and topology. She asserts that mathematics is antithetical to literature. She also says that brilliant, beautiful Alice, that is Alicia, is barely believable as a female human being. Then later on, she says the kid, however, makes the character of Alice real, but only in the passenger. It's always nice to read reviews after you've read the books because you can have assumptions challenged, you can have passages filled in, you can have things that you suspected affirmed, and you can just have things that somehow fled your mind recalled, such as the passage in which an electroshock treatment to Alicia cauterizes all of those characters, the horts in her head. I can't understand how I forgot about something like that. I think this is something brilliant that Williams included. She said, "It's said that McCarthy never writes about a place he's never been." This might be true, I suppose, with the exception of hell, the demonium, which he still manages to describe with obscene glamour. Obscene glamour is such a perfect descriptive of McCarthy's prose. Williams has another way to ascribe the passenger of the title, the passenger, not as this person who apparently fled the scene of this plane crash, but Williams says that the soul is the freed and missing passenger of these novels. She clearly enjoyed The Passenger much more than Stella Maris. In fact, she says that The Passenger might as well have been written on vellum as befits a codex. This gets at what I was feeling about it being almost like sacred writing or scripture. And she refers to The Passenger as an outrageous skirting of today's rules of literary engagement. Beautifully said. And lastly, I read James Wood's review in The New Yorker. This one was entitled The Numbers Game, Mythic Quests and Mathematicians in Cormac McCarthy's two novels, and it's from the December 19th, 2022 issue of The New Yorker. Wood divides McCarthy's dominant styles into two categories, afflatus and deflatus. As described by Wood, I saw both in the new novel. And in fact, Wood goes on to say that in previous novels, there has been a merging of the two styles into this third style that comes up again and again in The Passenger. I think that this is just a way more eloquent way and a way more thorough examination to describe what I sort of summed up as saying that the prose is schizophrenic. But I mean, it's no surprise that James Wood can go far beyond my powers as a reader. Wood offers that the kid is a nod to the character of the same name in Blood Meridian, which I too thought, but I couldn't really make a good connection there. I noted that Williams rejected that connection in her review. Of Bobby's dialogue in The Passenger, well, that's the only place it appears is in The Passenger, but this is how James Wood describes it. More often, he expresses himself in tough guy word bullets, like Steve McQueen playing a physicist. Every time I've read something from James Wood, there's always at least one sentence or one metaphor or just one way of describing something that really hits me. And I just think it's one of those things where you're like, man, I wish I had thought of that. And that was it for me. Earlier, I said that at the end of The Passenger, Bobby ended up on an island off the coast of Italy. Technically, it is in an old windmill on an island off the coast of Spain. Nonetheless, it's still in the Mediterranean Sea, so I don't feel too bad about the mistake. Wood zeroes in on McCarthy's one telling idea, as he has it, that words are latecomers to the truth, trailing numbers and music. This comes close to Pythagoras' idea that numbers encode divinity. And like I said earlier, there was that almost like a goading from McCarthy by way of Alicia, where there was this wondering if there was something to be decoded. All in all, Wood expresses a little bit of apprehension that McCarthy spending too much time around these physicists and mathematicians at the Santa Fe Institute is good for him as a novelist. Nonetheless, just as the other two reviewers pointed out, we've got two phenomenal books that aren't just cookie cutter of all the stuff that came before, but that give us a McCarthy trying to stretch out and branch into something new. Wood does also point out that McCarthy is, after all, a novelist, and there's a limit. He can't do math in the books. So instead, he is presenting a representation of genius. So now that I've read the 3 reviews, I'm going to go and catch the 2 podcasts on the 2 novels from Reading McCarthy, and I'll come back to give you my thoughts on those. I have just listened to Scott Yarborough's quick little episodes on his podcast, Reading McCarthy. The first episode came out in October, coinciding with the release of The Passenger, and the second episode came out in December, coinciding with the follow-up release of Stella Maris. If you're not familiar with Scott Yarborough, first and foremost, you should know that he does truly believe that Cormac McCarthy is our greatest living novelist. However, from what I took out of what he had to say about the 2 novels, he sort of has a lukewarm response. He enjoyed them, but they're not among his even top 5 McCarthy novels. He counts it among Cormac McCarthy's lesser or minor work. Now, some of this has to do with the fact that for Yarborough, he sees such a great divide between the subtext, which is basically all the quantum mechanics and mathematics that underpin and drive this tale. And he sees that as such a great divide from the text itself, which is what he refers to in terms of plot and character and so on. And as I've said, it's immediately apparent for anyone who reads The Passenger that McCarthy is not interested in that part of the aspect of a novel. Now, coincidentally, when I first started listening to the episode on The Passenger, Yarborough made it clear that this was a departure from his usual format. Usually he has at least one guest on there, a McCarthy scholar or otherwise appreciator or aficionado, and they have a discussion. But in these 2 very short episodes, he is just giving us a very quick first pass review or impression or response that he got from reading each book for the first time. He even apologizes for the fact that they are lightly edited. He just wanted to get something out there very quickly to give a sort of first word on these new novels. And again, while he does find much cud to chew, much to mull and graze over in the McCarthy novels, he basically says that as novels, they fail. Now, he did say that the ideal reader of these books would basically have 1 degree in literature and another degree in physics or mathematics. And this may be an indication of why I love the novels so much. Now, I don't have a degree specifically in physics or mathematics. However, I do have a degree in computer science, in addition to a degree in literature. And my computer science degree demanded that I take Calc 1, 2, 3, linear algebra, and so on. So also having a programming background as well as studying literature, he may well be right in that assessment. Now, even though his response to the novels as novels, the novel qua novel, even though it's lukewarm, he does say that it fascinated him enough to where he is compelled to reread it. And in his episode on Stella Maris, he mentions that he has reread The Passenger and enjoyed it more the second time. So perhaps over time, his judgment will change. But what's great about Scott Yarborough is that he can dig out so many great references and context and history. He points out where he saw Hemingway in these novels, where he saw Faulkner, but also Stephen Crane and even Don DeLillo. He's also very interested in the history of the development of these books in their writing, specifically pointing out that they appear to be works that have been in the making for a very long time. And he feels that the Stella Maris book that we have now was probably an interpolated text throughout The Passenger, but then it got replaced with those italicized bits, those interstitial episodes between the kid and Alicia. He is also in touch with a lot of different people who are very respectable readers and McCarthy scholars, and he said that there's great variance among all of them. Some see it as the greatest thing ever, and some see it as eh. And like I said, the Stella Maris episode is the same way as the Passenger episode. It's just a lightly edited, very quick assessment of Scott Yarborough's first brush with the novels. There's no guest. There's no exhaustive deep dive. He points out the similarities to The Sunset Limited. It's two people sitting across a table talking to each other about these extremely heady and enormous topics. He also makes a case for why we should not view Alicia as McCarthy's mouthpiece, even though it's very hard not to do that. He also, like others that I've now read, believes that the novels are definitely codependent upon each other. They shouldn't be split apart. And speaking of codependency and shouldn't be split apart, he mentions someone who is working on an article that will soon be published about how Alicia and Bobby are entangled particles. And I can't believe I didn't think about that with this whole context of quantum mechanics going on. And I think I even said something about the two being entangled throughout the novels or something like that. And even me saying the word entangled, for some reason, it didn't make me think of particle entanglement. This has now sparked a completely new interest and a completely new avenue of thinking about these books. Maybe we shouldn't actually be reading Alicia and Bobby as victims of paranoia and psychosis. This is what Scott says. What if this is not an aberration of Alicia's psyche? It's not a mental illness that she is seeing the kid and the Horts. What if she's actually able to perceive entities in another realm? After all, the kid does appear to Bobby at one point in The Passenger, and Bobby doesn't seem very surprised. In the end, however, Yarbrough sees all the talk of mathematics and physics as the book's greatest weakness. And he talks about how a lot of the dialogue in The Passenger, while great and proving once again that McCarthy is a maverick at capturing spoken language, a lot of it is just unnecessary. And he views the dialogue in Stella Maris as greatly superior. So in the end, a little bit of a lukewarm reception. However, there are glimmers of hope because he has also said that he's fascinated enough to want to reread them, and he has reread at least The Passenger and enjoyed it more on the second reading. However, it looks like what he finds as the book's greatest weakness is one of the elements that drew me in the most. I actually thought there was a wonderful balance between the novel qua novel and the smorgasbord of scientific ideas.